you guys, welcome back to my channel. I appreciate you coming back. If you're new here, my name is Madeleine Klein and I talk about Canadian true crime and missing persons. Today I want to talk about the tragic and not often talked about Shell Lake Massacre. I want to put a warning on this one. Not only does it include the death of children, but it also involves the torture and murder of animals. And we're going to jump right into it, so viewer discretion is advised. In the early morning hours of August 15th, 1967, 21-year-old Victor Ernest Hoffman left his parents' house in Leask, Saskatchewan to go for a drive. I think it's Leask, Saskatchewan. That's how it would phonetically be pronounced. I'm from Saskatchewan, I should know. 60 kilometers away, he would find a small farm located near the small town of Shell Lake, Saskatchewan. He entered the home with a .22 caliber pump-action rifle and murdered 9 out of the 10 members of the Peterson family inside the home. James Peterson, who was 47, and his wife Evelyn, who was 42 at the time, 17-year-old Jean, 13-year-old Mary, 11-year-old Dorothy, 9-year-old Pearl, 5-year-old William, 2-year-old Colin, and 1.5-year-old Larry. 27 out of the 28 shots fired met their target, with each victim being shot at least twice. Mr. Peterson was shot 7 times, many of which he endured when he was attempting to fight off and disarm the perpetrator. One lone survivor, 4-year-old Phyllis, remained under the covers between her sisters Jean and Mary, either being missed by Victor or being spared by him. We'll come back to this later. So we'll start at 8 a.m. that morning, August 15th, 1967. At around 8 a.m. that morning, a neighbor and good friend of the Petersons, Will Drew Lang, arrived at the property as he was supposed to help James with some chores. Will Drew actually began to work around the farm as he assumed James just hadn't gotten up yet. And at about 9 a.m., Will Drew went into the house to give James a hard time for sleeping in. When Will Drew got closer to the house, he noticed that the cows hadn't been milked and the front door of the home was open slightly. He immediately got a feeling of dread in his stomach and knew something wasn't right. The family dog, Skippy, who usually happily greeted Will Drew, remained silent. The dog did walk up to him, but stuck to the inside of his leg and didn't make a peep. Will Drew walked into the home to see James lying face down on the kitchen floor in only his underwear and lots of blood. Mrs. Peterson and 1-year-old Larry were found in the backyard just under an open window, and the rest of the children remained in their beds. Mr. Lang located the keys to the Petersons' family car and drove nearly 6.5 kilometers to the nearest telephone to call police. The closest police station would have been the RCMP in Spiritwood, 25 kilometers away. Police launched a massive investigation immediately. They had dogs searching the fields, they had their officers on all fours searching the entire Peterson land. They had roadblocks and they were looking into every strange car that had been in the village recently. They did everything they could, but nothing really came up. They couldn't find anything. There were no leads. It wasn't until 3 days later, Friday, August 18th, did the police recover and positively identify the .22 caliber. On August 19th, 1967, at about 5:30 p.m., just hours after the funeral for all 9 of the Peterson family, police arrest Victor Hoffman at his parents' house in Leask, Saskatchewan, and he goes without struggle. At first, it was unclear what led them to Victor. It was said a member of the RCMP had a very casual conversation with an individual that led them to believe it wise to check out the Hoffman house. But the further I looked into this case, I found out that this very casual conversation was actually a concerned member of the community and a neighbor to Victor Hoffman and his family. This neighbor walked into the Shellbrook RCMP detachment on August 18th and said to them, "My neighbor's kid just got out of a mental hospital and he likes guns and he's good at hunting." Police took this tip and went to the Hoffman farm, and this is where they recovered the .22 caliber rifle as well as they took a pair of rubber boots. They would later positively identify the boot soles as matching the bloody footprints found in the Peterson's kitchen. The same day, they flew the gun into Regina to have it tested at the lab there, and ballistics positively identified the gun as the murder weapon. The next day, August 19th, Victor Hoffman is arrested and charged for murder. So a little bit about Victor Hoffman. Victor was a 21-year-old farmer from Leask, Saskatchewan. He had always been a very, very quiet kid with few friends. It was said he was always kind of a loner. From the age of 6, he started to hear voices and see the devil, a large black creature about 6 feet tall with a long tail and no genitals. Direct quote. Shortly after he began to see the devil, Victor would also see angels too, but not as frequently. By 10 years old, Victor felt murderous impulses. Victor would say he often thought about killing his family or any stranger that he met, but instead of killing people, he would instead torture and kill cats, dogs, and rodents. I won't get into super detail, but I know that he clubbed a cat to death, he starved a cat. Victor loved to hunt wild game as well. It's said that killing animals made him happy. Victor didn't tell his parents or anyone else about the voices or the devil or the impulses. He believed no one would believe him. He would later say he told his siblings about seeing the devil numerous times, but they just laughed at him. He would continue to be visited by the devil throughout his life. Between the ages of 15 and 17, Victor took a liking to guns and started stealing firearms and ammunition. He was caught once and received a 2-year suspended sentence. At 18, Victor states he caught the devil but let him go. In 1965, when Victor was 19, he tried to shoot the devil and threw a net on top of him, taking his powers away. However, another guardian devil was there and gave the powers back. The devil then threw Victor to the ground and got away. In late May of 1967, Victor's mental health started obviously declining. So much so that even his usually blissfully ignorant parents started to notice. He was usually quiet and withdrawn to begin with, but Victor started to talk in circles and couldn't remember anything. And he would also just burst into laughter for no apparent reason. On May 27th, 1967, Stella Hoffman was in her kitchen and she heard 2 shots being fired outside. When she went to investigate, she was met with Victor, who shot 1 more round straight up into the air, looked at her and said, "I shot the devil." His mother asked him not to shoot and to please give her the gun. When Victor left later that day, it's said that his mother and siblings hid all of the guns in the house. Immediately upon arriving home, Victor asks about where his guns are, and when he was told that he couldn't have them, he said, "Nobody will get hurt," and left the house again. Not long after that, he returned back to the house and asked to speak with a pastor. Mrs. Hoffman would say that she wasn't sure what Victor and the pastor talked about while he was there, but before the pastor left, she overheard Victor tell him, "I'd like to kill Mom and Dad." On May 28th, Victor's taken to Prince Albert to see a psychiatrist who says Victor is very, very sick and should be checked into a hospital immediately. The next day, on May 29th, 1967, Victor's father brings him to the Saskatchewan Hospital in North Battleford, and he voluntarily checks himself in. According to hospital records, Victor was very sick, both mentally and physically, when he was admitted. He would talk to himself or just laugh when he was alone and complained of stomach cramps and feeling a burning sensation. He was cooperative when being examined, but just super withdrawn and indifferent. Victor told the hospital staff that the devil put somebody else's brain in his body as punishment for not selling his soul. The brain belonged to a woman named Denise, and Denise wanted the rest of Victor's body for herself, and this made Victor hate her. Victor was diagnosed as schizophrenic, chronic with uncontrolled symptoms and severe social handicaps. During his stay at the Saskatchewan Hospital, Victor would receive 12 electric shock treatments, therapy, and be put on tranquilizers. It would be after the 2nd electric shock treatment that they saw a slight improvement. After the 5th session, Victor claimed that seeing and speaking to the devil was just his imagination, but he still had magic powers. Victor received all 12 electric shock treatments, but still at times believed that the black devil with the long tail was still with him. He even told the staff if he was discharged, he would try and catch the devil and kill him. Victor would then go on to say that he had thought about it for 2 days and decided that his ideas about the devil were just his imagination and he was ready to go home. Victor appeared to be happy and social and considered himself free from the devil, but he was still having impulses to kill. The psychiatrist at the hospital would tell Victor's father that Victor was schizophrenic and it would be at least a year or two before he was well. But on July 26, 1967, after 58 days of treatment and only 4 weeks after telling Victor's father it would take a year for him to be well, Victor was released to his parents on tranquilizers. 3 pills twice daily. Here's where things get a little dicey and statements conflict. Victor's parents would say they were shocked at the release of their son, seeing as the psychiatrist told them just weeks prior it would take 1 to 2 years. However, the psychiatrist, Dr. Jedlicki, would say that he only told his parents that because his parents wanted to take him home after a week. Mr. and Mrs. Hoffman would say nobody properly explained Victor's diagnosis to them, whereas Dr. Jedlicki would later call them simple-minded people who didn't want to believe the severity of their son's diagnosis. Mr. Hoffman stated that nobody at the hospital told him how important Victor's medication was and what could possibly happen if he didn't take it. Dr. Jedlicki denies this, stating, quote, "Everybody's informed of this," even though he was not present at the time of Victor's release. In my opinion, the truth lies somewhere in the middle. I believe Victor's parents were in denial and kind of buried their head in the sand when it came to their son's condition. They would argue that he was a totally normal child up until May of 1967. His father denies him hearing voices from a young age because he would have just known that about his son. But on the other hand, it was the 1960s in rural Saskatchewan. These people had no idea about mental health issues or how to deal with a severely mentally ill child. But then, to me, Dr. Jedlicki also sounds arrogant and dismissive. I think he expected Mr. and Mrs. Hoffman to have the same level of comprehension that he did, but that just wasn't the case. At home, Victor would complain that the medication made his back and head hurt and he slept a lot. His parents would say that the pills doped him up and he didn't talk much, if ever. If you asked him something, he would reply, but that's about it. Victor's parents were convinced that Victor was sedated at the time of his release, and this drug stayed in his system for 3 days. Dr. Jedlicki denies sending Victor home on any sedation. And when he was asked if it was possible Victor could have received something without his knowledge or orders, he replied, "Impossible." Dismissive and arrogant. Like, I can't even imagine the shit that went on in hospitals, in mental hospitals in the 1960s. Oh my God. Between July 26th and August 8th, Victor would have good and bad days with no apparent consistency. By August 11th, he was imagining killing somebody and in the early stages of a schizophrenic episode. The next day, August 12th, Victor continued to think about killing, thinking that murdering somebody would bring him closer to the devil. On August 14th, 1967, it was a relatively normal day at the Hoffman household. Victor would spend the day on the tractor, and he ended up falling asleep on the couch at about 9:30 p.m. His parents woke him up around 11:30 p.m. He took his medication, and he was sent to his bed where he would sleep until about 3 a.m. At 3 a.m., he got up, used the washroom, laid down on the couch, but couldn't fall back asleep. Unable to sleep, Victor got up and worked in the garage for about an hour. It's said that on his way out to the garage, he saw a dog and had the impulse to kill it, but thankfully didn't. After working in the garage for an hour, Victor started to pace. He said he had a sudden strange feeling to the right side of his head. He said it felt like his body had been split in half and something left him. He said he wasn't in any pain and the desire and impulse to kill was overwhelming. He often thought about killing his family and did in that moment. But instead, he took his .22 caliber rifle and went for a drive. We know what happens from here. Victor drives about 60 kilometers and chooses a small, white, 4-bedroom farmhouse. Victor said he came to other farmhouses where the urge to kill was strong, but for whatever reason, he resisted and moved on. When Victor chose and entered the Peterson farmhouse, he believed he had seen the house before in a dream. James Peterson had heard the Pontiac Victor was driving approach from a distance, so he was sitting up on the edge of his bed. Victor loudly entered the home just after 6 a.m. James started yelling from his bedroom, "Who is it? Who's there?" Once James saw the gun, a struggle ensued. James tried to grab Victor by the neck. Victor continued to shoot, and James ended up being shot 7 times. Victor would leave the gasping and struggling James on the kitchen floor and step outside to reload his rifle. When Victor returned, he placed 3 more bullets into James, finally ending his suffering. Victor then went into the children's bedroom and shot daughters Jean and Mary in their beds. It's said that the 2 young girls begged and pleaded for their lives. Victor then turned the gun on to the other young children who were hysterical and screaming but remained in their beds. Victor then heard a noise of someone trying to escape through a window. He went outside through the window of the children's bedroom and caught Mrs. Peterson trying to flee out of another window with 1.5-year-old Larry. Victor shot Mrs. Peterson 4 times in the back, leaving 1-year-old Larry sitting there confused and sobbing. As if this story isn't already horrific enough, it's said that Victor goes back into the house because Jean, Mary, and Dorothy were all still screaming and hysterical. Victor had already shot all of the children at least once, but they were still alive, so he went back in to finish the job. 27 out of the 28 rounds fired met their target. That is nightmare fuel. They were all shot several times, surviving most of the torture. Like I said before, each child being shot at least twice. After the home was silent, Victor went back outside and killed 1-year-old Larry by shooting him twice in the head. Victor would state that he didn't want to kill the baby, but he didn't want to see him suffer. He believed the baby may not have been found for 3 or 4 days and didn't want it to starve to death. So he shot him. He said he killed the rest of the family so that nobody could identify his license plate. Before he left, Victor would search for the bullets he littered into the Peterson family, even shaking the bedsheets looking for them. He would collect 17 of his shell casings. He would also take a jar of shells, $7, and 2 purses or wallets. These would later be found stuffed between rocks on the Hoffman property, so I'm thinking they were like wallet pocketbook type things. They contained the identification cards for Evelyn and Jean Peterson. As we know, 4-year-old Phyllis was spared for an unknown reason. I originally thought that Victor just accidentally missed her because she was under the covers between her 2 sisters, but he would later state that he looked at her and knew she was there, and he also went looking for the shell casings of his gun, so he was shaking bed sheets. He would have found her and knew she was there. His story about why he spared her changed several times as well. At first he said he just missed her, and then he said that because she was under the covers, she couldn't identify him. Then he said he spared her because she had the face of an angel, and then went on to say she was the only one that looked human. The others all resembled pigs to him while he was murdering them. And then he decided that he didn't know why he didn't kill her. She wasn't found until police arrived on the scene and noticed something moving under the covers of a bed. She was carried out by this police officer who she remembers was in tears, and she was placed in the care of an aunt and uncle about 3 kilometers away. This aunt and uncle that were only 3 kilometers away were actually a farm that Victor stopped at. He stopped and contemplated their property, but for whatever reason decided to move on to the Petersons. Just eerie. On July 7th, 1967, just over a month before the murders, the oldest Peterson daughter, Kathy, had gotten married and moved out to BC with her new husband. After the murder of her family, she and her husband moved back to Saskatchewan to take custody and raise Phyllis. To my knowledge, both women remain in the Shell Lake area to this day. After the murder of 9 people, Victor drove home feeling ill and contemplating killing himself. It's later found out that Victor actually attempted suicide 6 or 7 times previous by carbon monoxide poisoning in his garage. Obviously, was unsuccessful each time. He returned home just after 7:30 a.m. and his father was already up doing chores on the farm. When his father asked him, "Where have you been?" Victor replied that he was at their other farm looking for deer. They had 2 farms, they had 2 properties. Victor then helped his father around the farm and appeared normal. At the time, he didn't think what he had done was wrong because the devil told him to do it. But he was scared of the law and getting into trouble. He didn't want to be put in jail and said that he hated being locked up. As the day progressed, Victor began to feel more guilty and anxious, but he believed that by killing, his killing impulses were cured, and he surely wouldn't be able to kill again. On Friday, August 18th, police showed up to gather some evidence. This is when police ask Robert Hoffman how many guns he has, and he says, "Well, let me take a look." He remembered Victor had told him he was out looking for deer that morning of the 15th, but didn't remember seeing Victor bring a gun out of his car. Mr. Hoffman went to Victor's car expecting to find a .303 rifle used for hunting, but instead, in the back seat, he found a seldom used .22 caliber rifle. It was also at this time police noticed 2 pairs of rubber boots on the porch. The firearm and footwear were both taken in. When Victor was finally arrested on August 19th, police took him to the North Battleford police station and questioned him on his whereabouts of that Tuesday morning. He told police pretty much what I just told you. He fell asleep on the couch at 9:30 the previous night, went up to bed at 11:30, woke up at 3, couldn't sleep, went out to the garage to do some work. He told them he went out looking for deer at about 5 a.m. and returned to the farm just after 7:30. He had breakfast, did his chores, and that was that. The police then asked Victor, "What about the boots?" To which Victor replied, "Someone took them." The police were like, "How'd they get back?" And they were met with silence. After the police told Victor that they absolutely did not believe his story about the boots, Victor let everything out. After telling police what happened, Victor would say to them, "Just know I'm sick in the head, but I could never kill again. I know that." On Monday, August 21st, 1967, Victor was formally charged for non-capital murder and remanded to 30 days at the Saskatchewan Hospital in North Battleford for psychiatric evaluation. But what many don't know is there was a second court appearance that day where they actually changed their mind on where Victor was being sent. They agreed it would be pointless to send him back to the Saskatchewan hospital because he was just there. It was decided that Victor would be sent to Saskatoon for psychiatric evaluation. And he was scheduled to be back before the magistrate just 4 days later on August 25th, not 30 days. On August 25th, Victor was found fit to stand trial and would remain in custody in Prince Albert until his preliminary hearing on October 24th, 1967. The preliminary hearing would last 2 days, and it was decided that there was enough evidence to go to trial. Victor's trial was set to begin January 8th, 1968. Remember, the defense wasn't denying that Victor had committed this crime. They had to prove that Victor was insane at the time of the crime being committed to get a verdict of not guilty by reason of insanity. I'm unsure why, but Victor was only being charged for the murder of the parents, James and Evelyn, and not their 7 slain children. In the 2 cases of non-capital murder, if found guilty, Victor was facing life in prison with no possibility of parole. I didn't know this, but a capital murder charge was reserved for an on-duty cop or prison guard being murdered, and the conviction was an automatic death sentence. Non-capital murder, I guess, was for when, anyone else was killed. Anyway, the trial went pretty much as you would expect it to. The Crown called 16 witnesses to testify on their behalf, the defense only 4. One of the defense witnesses, Dr. Peterson, I'm probably for sure saying that wrong, he had evaluated Victor on 3 separate occasions, August 23rd, 24th, and January 8th. And he concluded and confirmed Victor had acute schizophrenia, which by today's standards, I believe, is paranoid schizophrenia. Dr. McCarricher would tell the court, in his opinion, Victor didn't know what he was doing at the time of the murder and wasn't aware that it was wrong. He said that from August 11th to halfway through the slayings, Victor was experiencing like a schizophrenic episode. He was most likely jolted back into reality when he saw the bodies and all of the blood. He would say that it was probably the shock of coming back to reality that saved Phyllis. After the murders and being rocked back into reality, Victor panicked and started collecting the shell casings. Rifle cartridges? They gotta be the same thing. I should have looked that up. The doctor would say Victor showed great remorse over the killings in his interviews with him. Another doctor, Dr. Hoffman, would testify that Victor started hearing voices at the age of 6 and started getting murderous impulses at the age of 10. I won't go too much into that because we've already covered it. Dr. Hoffman from Saskatoon, Saskatchewan, stated that on August 15th, Victor thought about killing his parents, but decided to go for a drive instead. Dr. Hoffman believes Victor saw the devil and heard voices that were very real to him. For years, Victor had been faced with internal conflict, having the devil and angels telling him to do different things. Victor felt stealing was wrong and against the law, but murder was okay. He was aware of what he was doing, but had permission from God to do so. So he didn't think it was wrong. Dr. Hoffman would say Victor did not feel guilty after committing this atrocity. He had been feeling murderous impulses for the last decade. Stella Hoffman testified that her son was released too early into her care without proper discharge instructions. She, like many others at the time, had no idea about mental illness. And the staff at the hospital gave her no information on the illness or following treatment. Victor was given pills, but no further information as to how important they were. On January 11th, 1968, after 3 days of trial, it took 3.5 hours for the 12-man jury to reach their verdict. In the charge of 2 counts of non-capital murder, Victor Ernest Hoffman was found not guilty by reason of insanity. During the reading of his verdict, Victor showed no emotion, was almost robotic, and even took a tranquilizer. Victor was held in Saskatchewan for 2 months before being transferred to Oak Ridge, the maximum security psychiatric hospital in Pentanguishene, Ontario. Victor arrived at Oak Ridge on March 27th, 1968, and would remain there for the rest of his life. This is the 3rd time this hospital has come up in my videos. If you remember my first video about Peter Woodcock, Oak Ridge is where he spent the majority of his life after killing 3 children at the age of 17. I'll link that video below, but get this, Peter Woodcock would kill again on his first day pass out in 30 years in July of 1991. This murder happened 6 months before Victor Hoffman was granted his first day pass out in December of 1991. Obviously, nothing bad happened because, to my knowledge, in 2001, he received an escorted pass to what I'm assuming was like the town and not just the hospital grounds. There was a December 2001 Toronto Sun article on it. I could only see the title, but I could not access the article. So I don't actually know what went down there. I'm just assuming. Anyway, Victor Hoffman would spend the rest of his life in the hospital for the criminally insane until he died of cancer on May 21st, 2004. If this case strikes your morbid curiosity and you want to dig a little bit deeper, please read this book. Please. This book, Shell Lake Massacre by Peter Tadman, is not only the only book I could find on the Shell Lake Massacre, but it is unbelievably informative. I read it in a day, less than 24 hours. This book is where I got 98% of my information from for this video. Shell Lake Massacre was written in 1992. It goes over Victor Hoffman's history, a little bit of the Peterson's history, the crime, the months leading up to the crime, the arrest, the trial, the aftermath. There are actual letters that were sent to both the Peterson and Hoffman families, never before seen photos. Tadman interviews Kathy and Phyllis, who are, I believe, 45 and 29 at the time of the interviews. These women are the epitome of, like, grace. I can't believe how, like, forgiving and they're just, You have to read what they have to say about this. It is just like amazing. They are better women than I. Tadman speaks to Mr. and Mrs. Hoffman in this book. There are court transcripts. I cannot say enough good things about this book. It is such a good read. I also couldn't find it anywhere and waited for 2 weeks for it to arrive at my local library. It was most definitely worth the wait, but I will warn you, it gets graphic. I'll link the Amazon link down below, but it's like not available, and the one copy that is over $200. It is bizarre. Just borrow it from your library. That's what I did. I just can't believe that to this day, the Saskatchewan hospital hasn't been held responsible or taken any accountability for releasing Victor Hoffman far too soon. They confidently released an obviously very ill patient who 3 weeks later committed Canada's worst random mass murder. This story is especially tragic and frustrating because there's no motive and no connection to the killer and the killed. With a little attentiveness, this horrific tragedy could have been prevented. So that's the story of Victor Hoffman and the Shell Lake Massacre. As always, I'm going to post some links below. Check them out if you are interested in this story. I'll post the Amazon link to Shell Lake Massacre. I'll post an article that I found very helpful. I'll post my Peter Woodcock YouTube link down below. I always say this in every video, but this was the Reader's Digest version. The Victor Hoffman interviews alone are a rabbit hole. I want to thank you guys so much for being here. Please don't forget to subscribe so you don't miss a case. My link tree will also be linked below if the spirit moves you to follow me on any of my socials. And I think that is it for me until next time. Talk to you guys later. Bye.